We're excited to have Adhvaryu do our presentation today. And Ach is an associate professor of business economics and public policy at the University of Michigan's Ross School of Business. And so it is a little bit of a different type of background than our other global mental health talks. Which is fantastic because I love these talks, and it really shows how mental health impacts things that are of interest to people across different disciplines. So from biological to clinical to the social sciences, and we all look at things related to mental health slightly differently as exposure outcomes somewhere in the way. And so one of the things that I think has been really fun about this seminar series and my own work in this space is just learning from people who take a very different perspective on this from me as a social epidemiologist. So Ach's work focuses a lot on the intersection of economic development and health economics. And he's going to talk to us today about sharing information related to COVID and mental health. So over to you. And actually, before you start, do you have any preference for people interrupting with questions, or you want to save it all to the end? Anything?
No, that'd be great if people could just chime right in and, on Zoom, you can either just unmute yourself or just raise your hand and I'll hopefully just see it. It'll pop on the top of my screen there. So I can call on you too, whatever you prefer.
Perfect. All right. Thanks. Take it away.
Well, first of all, thank you, Asha, and to everyone who is here today. I'm very much grateful for the time that you're giving towards this seminar and for listening in, as well as giving your comments and feedback. I should mention, just at the outset, my co-author on this work, Sadish, is here with us. So I was lucky enough that he could make it. So I'm going to direct all difficult questions, particularly around the implementation, to him because he was actually the one who coordinated this trial on the ground when he was a member of Good Business Lab, my nonprofit, and executed the study really well in India. And so happy to have him here. Also want to mention, as Asha mentioned, I'm definitely not a mental health expert, and I am somebody who is kind of an interloper in the area, but I'm really interested and learning more and really excited to get feedback from the real experts out there in this virtual room. So please, any and all feedback is very welcome. I should also mention just before I start that while this project has come to an end and is conditionally accepted a journal, we are actually planning a scale up of the project right now, which I would really love any and all feedback and comments on, because as most of you probably already know, the COVID pandemic, has reached crisis levels in India right now and is on everybody's mind. In addition to the sort of physical health toll, there's of course just anxiety and stress and mental health impacts abound. And so one of the things that we thought we could do, given the positive results of this trial, was to help scale some of information provision through real interactions. And so that's something that we're trying to organize right now through Good Business Lab and partner organizations. So that involves basically designing the intervention from scratch so that we can actually kind of provide it at scale. And so I would love to discuss that idea, which is really at its nascent stages, and anything you have in way of feedback or comments regarding that would be very welcome and would have high marginal value because we're just starting out on that venture. So let me tell you a bit more right now about what we did in this project, and then I'd love to get your feedback. Throughout the presentation, feel free to interrupt or raise your hand. So this project is about information and anxiety, evidence from a randomized COVID-19 Information Campaign. And as I mentioned, Sadish D is my co-author who's here with us today. I also had my longtime collaborator, Anant Neshadam, is on this paper as well. Just to give you a bit of background on, our interest in this area, as many of you as mental health, experts know, information can be a double-edged sword. So, misinformation can lead to persistent kind of risky health behavior. So, for example, there's some recent papers out there that look at misinformation and the COVID-19 pandemic. For example, this paper by Burstein and co-authors shows that bad information from TV programs in the U.S. is correlated with high rates of COVID-19 infections and deaths. And we know from a lot of other work in settings outside of COVID-19 that misinformation about disease risk can have big impacts on the kinds of behaviors that have longer term consequences. We also know that information can induce anxiety, sometimes factual information, sometimes when individuals have to discern whether information is factual or not, that process can generate a lot of anxiety. So there's, a lot of acute stress and depressive symptoms during the COVID-19 pandemic, which has been, well documented, particularly among those who are more exposed to ambiguous information. And we all know, for those of us who have either interacted with or done work in lower income country contexts, that ambiguous information abounds. We know if I have a family WhatsApp group, for example, and I receive all kinds of dubious forwards and other pleas and things like that that make it really stressful, even as an expert, or as someone who is relatively well informed, to be basing my decision making on. So we know that kind of ambiguity and a lack of clarity on whether information is true or false can be really distressful.
Ask a quick question about that. Do
Yeah.
we want to be thinking about types of people? Like there might be individuals who need the information, want information, for whom that can be not necessarily anxiety provoking, versus you're much better not knowing about it and you provide me additional information and now that makes me anxious. Is that something we should be thinking about?
That's interesting. I hadn't drawn that distinction before. Basically, I'll tell you the group of study participants that we're going to be looking at here are sort of like relatively poorly informed at baseline, and so my guess is that like sort of good information is likely, that they're seeking out information at this point. This was kind of, I'll frame it for you a bit, but this was kind of during the first surge of COVID-19, and these workers were essentially migrants who were basically stranded in the city and with very little information on when they were going to be able to return home, when the factory was going to be able to open up again, and what their status of their families were, and that sort of thing. So I think, at this stage, probably information was a good. But of course, having access to bad information could potentially pollute that. And I also just mention, it's it is, we do make a distinction with types of individuals. We're thinking more about kind of people who are more likely to be, have access to good information versus those who are not. And the way that we kind of proxy for that is by using smartphones ownership. So we'll see some differential impacts via smartphone ownership. But your question about sort of like seeking out information versus like, my utility is higher, just knowing less. That's a good question that that I have to think about more.
Can I just follow up on that, something related? I think so in addition to kind of misinformation or how good it is or ambiguous, is just that more information could increase someone's perception of risk. and anxiety. So just even if it's good information, which is kind of tied to your point, but if you're like, oh my God, this thing is airborne, I need to wear a mask, I need to be 6 feet apart. And so you're even if it's good information, if it's high risk kind of panicky information, it could lead to anxiety and then cause all these problems on your slide.
That's right. No, and I think you're absolutely right. That's kind of what we had in mind. That if we start providing all this information to participants, that's not necessarily a good thing for mental health. While it might be good for knowledge, mental health may go the other direction. So that's truly why we we're sort of agnostic coming in about what we expected. So that's a great point. Further than anxiety, we know that anxiety is sort of consistently associated with poor working memory and other measures of cognitive function. And so, that might compound the inability to make good decisions if information brings on anxiety, either because it's false or ambiguous, or because actually it's truthful, but it induces a feeling of more risk, or that you're in trouble. Okay, so 1 second. There you go. So then, the key question that we asked in this paper was, can we broadcast information without hurting mental health? And in particular, what we thought about considering after thinking about a variety of different ways of thinking about information delivery was that we wanted to test out the relative differences in knowledge and ultimately in mental health from accessing information in 3 different kinds of common ways in which people hear about information about in crisis situations. So the first is kind of SMS messages, and the second is a pre-recorded audio message, and the third is kind of a live phone call in which people were on the other end of the line actually delivering the information in person. And the reasons for this are mostly policy related. So as all of us know, during crisis periods, for example, governments and large employers and other organizations use banner messages or text message alerts to kind of inform people about certain risks, or to remind them about the kinds of behaviors that are positive in terms of public health. And they often do this either by text message or by pre-recorded audio message. And these are kind of considered the best ways to go about doing this because you can reach a really wide audience, and they tend to be extremely cost effective. We decided to test these common modes of information delivery against what we thought was a sort of a more expensive but potentially better option for particularly for knowledge absorption and potentially also for mental health, which was a kind of a live person on the other end of the line. So what we just noted from our own behavior and understanding of the world, as well as what we heard in anecdotal accounts when we were designing the study, is that live interaction kind of tends to have a positive effect on kind of absorption. So can I actually just hear this information and kind of start processing it because someone is actually on the other end of the line telling me, and it's a more natural interaction than kind of listening to an audio message or reading a text message that I know is kind of a widely distributed message. And then that may also have independent effects on mental health. If I'm just speaking to somebody in this kind of very anxiety-prone time, is there someone actually, a voice on the other end of the line that's actually talking to me? So we, randomized the participants into these 3 groups, and then we had baseline and endline measurements of, amongst other things, knowledge related to COVID-19 and to measures of anxiety and depression. So let me tell you a bit about the sample, just to give you some background on who we're intervening on. So this was kind of back in the first peak, as I mentioned, of the pandemic. And this was a period of time when migrants in India were often stranded in cities because of lockdown restrictions, that place restrictions on mobility of people. And this was kind of widely discussed, and there were really tragic and heartbreaking accounts of migrants, traveling like 1,000 miles over foot to reach their families because they had no information and hadn't, the trains were stopped and they had no mode of transportation of getting home to their villages. For the migrants that were involved in our sample, actually these were garment workers who were living in hostels in the Bangalore area, and the hostels were sort of adjacent to large garment factories where they worked. And these workers were essentially stranded in the hostels under lockdown with very little ability to communicate effectively with their families back home. And as I'll show you, their information about COVID-19 and the disease characterization and the risk they faced was also pretty poor. And so we thought, this really just started as a way for us as researchers who were working with this sample on other studies that kind of came to a halt. And we said, hey, you know what? We have the phone numbers of these individuals. Why don't we, talk to them and give them more information and figure out whether that's actually a good thing or a bad thing. And so that's kind of how the genesis of this study. And as you can imagine, this is sort of a very particular time and a very particular sample. And so that might affect the generalizability and ultimately the scale up that I mentioned that we're trying to undertake. Unfortunately, we find ourselves in another highly anxiety provoking period of time with the crisis raging in India. And so again, we face some of the same kind of contextual conditions, and we thought that some of the learnings might be applicable. Okay, so before I tell you a bit more about kind of what we measured and all that, I'll just tell you the general takeaway from the study was that compared to participants who are receiving audio messages, and actually for most outcomes compared to participants who were receiving the text messages as well, what we found was that pre-recorded messages, live phone calls ended up generating more kind of information absorption. So people were more likely to stay on the phone longer. They're more likely to listen to the full message, and were sort of opted to have the message repeated more often. They also improved kind of objective measures of knowledge, especially amongst individuals without smartphones, who, at baseline, presumably had lower levels of knowledge. And importantly, the live phone calls compared to the other methods of information provision reduced depression and anxiety by about 16%. And the amount of information that was delivered actually doesn't fully explain this effect. So, the key finding that we have here is that, knowledge provision, increases when you have live individual on the other line. And part of that translates into a larger mental health impact. But, when we do some sensitivity analysis, what we find is that even controlling for the amount of information that people have doesn't fully kind of explain away this kind of mental health effect of kind of actually just talking to a real live person, even though, and this is a critical piece of the way the trial was administered, the people who are delivering information by live phone calls were taught to say exactly what was delivered by the pre-recorded audio message. So, there wasn't kind of any additional counseling or other kind of conversation that was going on by design. And so, that might speak to kind of the effects of just having another person on the other end of the line being positive for mental health. And it might also speak a little bit to the fact that knowledge was slightly higher in this group as well. Sorry, there's somebody who was question there.
No, Acha, I was going to just ask you about that. The time when you did this was during the first surge that was happening in India, and Karnataka had imposed major lockdowns as well. So were the study participants basically in isolation at that time? Do you know something about like how much social
Yeah.
distancing or isolation they were experiencing?
Yeah. So the study participants were sort of relatively isolated in the sense that they weren't interacting with the world around them, but within their hostels, which were their main kind of hubs of social interaction in the first place, they were relatively unrestricted.
I see.
And indeed, like for part of this period, actually, the migrants were actually coming into work. This garment factory started making PPE, and so the migrants were actually involved in making PPE, for distribution and all that. So
it's not like they were completely isolated, deprived of human contact, and then you guys were the only ones calling them or something like that.
Right. No. So that's the thing. We unfortunately we don't have a lot of measures of like loneliness or of sort of the extent of social interaction that we could use here. But so this is anecdotal, but what we've noticed in other studies and what I think is generally true is that most of the social interaction that these workers did in the first place was with their hostel mates, so the people they lived with in their room, people in the hostel, which was, say 80 to 100 people per hostel, as well as kind of the broader factory environment. But most of their friends are going to be sort of the people they live with, and so they had access to those people. What they didn't have access to was the broader world, maybe like their where they get their fruits and vegetables, where they the place where they go to hang out and have some ice cream, or all that kind of stuff. That was, of course, shut down. So yeah.
There's a couple of questions in the comments. I don't know if you want to look at them or circle back.
Yeah, no, I can definitely check it out. You may get this in a minute, but how are the site questions administered? I guess they were administered by phone. So all the interaction was by phone. So we essentially had survey, enumerators calling up the participants and basically delivering the questionnaires over the phone. And the other question was, how much did the live calls divert from the script or have conversations? And there, I'll let Sadish confirm that, but as per the protocol, we really wanted to keep things as tightly linked to the recorded information as possible. So we're sort of controlling for that effect. So there was no live, we had prescribed these survey enumerators just to read off the script and repeat the information if necessary, if they were asked, but not to have any outside conversation in addition to that. Now the question, like if it would be unnatural, I'm guessing, for somebody to sort of not respond if if they were asked an additional question or there was some other query or comment that was made. Sadish, maybe you can comment to that. Did we have a way of kind of dealing with that, or is that just a natural part of the variable that may exist?
Sure. So what can you guys hear me?
Yes.
Okay. So what we did a couple of things here. One is we worked off the script. We only had one person deliver live phone calls. So there was only one person in one voice, and the same person made the audio recordings as well. So we're sending out the same voice when you're comparing. So what is common between the audio recording and the live phone calls is that it's the same person delivering in the same voice, and we also actually control the speed of it. So once we had the audio recording, the person making the live phone call, they had this tablet where There were, I think, 7 paragraphs. So for each paragraph, we restricted it so that unless they spend a certain amount of time in that paragraph, a certain number of seconds, they cannot proceed. So that the speed at which they read the script, it matches the speed at which the audio recordings is delivering the information. So those are the kind of things we did to make sure that these two are, really, really comparable. In terms of other interactions, we decided not to record and audit the conversations, but we had trained the person to absolutely not counsel, because also, when you get into that, we have to start worrying about the, that person's own mental health as well. So we had trained them not to counsel. We figured that a lot of times they would ask about information about factories. And so that also we said don't give information, because we didn't have the information. We didn't know what the factory is going to when they were open and whatnot. And there's a few other things. I think what could be different is that when you call someone, a lot of times these were a lot of the ladies, what they do is they give you the phone number of their husbands or of a friend. So when you call them up, it could be that you're not actually on the phone with someone. So if you're sending out an audio recording or a text message, it might just not go to the person who you are actually going to survey in the end. Because when you survey them, you ask for the exact person. And when you're delivering the phone calls, it would just be very unnatural. So they were allowed to find the right person. So if the husband answers the phone and you're actually looking for the wife, then they were allowed to ask for that person. But that wasn't those cases were, I think, in the single digits. So we looked at a few of these things, and because the result is so surprising, at least for me, we went and looked at these things, but none of these things really are explaining what's happening.
One last thing you mentioned here about the engagement being more on with the phone messages being repeated. How did you deal with the issue of multiple languages in these settings? Like there might be Kannada speakers or Hindi speakers in the factories and stuff.
We only the whole sample spoke only Oriya, so we worked only with Oriya speakers. All the surveyors were Oriya, and the messages were translated and sent in Oriya.
Thank you.
Sorry, following up on the delivery of the delivery.
Yeah.
So thinking more about the scale up, I understand why you want to really force the two conditions to be similar to each other from a scientific purpose, but from the purpose of scaling up and doing it at a bigger for reaching more people, I could assume that for the person who's receiving the call, it would be more natural to have a conversation rather than just a script at a certain speed. Is it more, what about the person who's actually making the phone call? Is it more costly and complicated for them to have an accurate conversation, or the limitations that you gave them was actually kind of bothering them, and it would make more natural for both to just have a normal conversation?
No, I think you're right. I mean, I think the limitations imposed on the live call in the study were because we wanted, to be able to attribute the mode of delivery, to the treatment effect, as opposed to, other things that were different about the content or the tone of the conversation or the interaction. So I think that when we think about scale up, and we're still sort of very nascent, stages thinking about this, it makes much more sense. The analogy that we're trying to draw, when we do this in the scale up is to have volunteers logging into a sort of phone banking system, similar to, the way that you would phone bank for a political candidate or campaign. So you would kind of log on to the system, and it would have kind of prompts that are smart, in the sense that they mostly just deliver information, but there's certain things where if the person, for example, flags that they that they're in a very dire mental health state, or that they have, extreme anxiety or whatever, that you would know what to say in response to that, and you could refer them to the right resources, etc. So, the conversation may take several paths, and, we would try to control it to a certain extent because we want to, the interactions to be of high quality, and we want to make sure that, Manoj is not going off script and, telling some participant what the, latest WhatsApp gossip is or whatever. I think that we would want to make sure that we have as high quality information as possible, that it's, verified, and that it's delivered in the kind of way that we would want it. But other than that, we would want that, the conversation does kind of follow its own path, and that there's a natural interaction, because ultimately, I think having the live person, that's part of where our treatment effects are coming from, I believe. Cool. Okay, so let me tell you a little bit about knowledge at baseline. So, just to give you a sense of the sample, as Satish mentioned, this was a predominantly female sample. About between half and 2/3 of the sample is female, relatively young, in their early 20s. It's a very transient, or mobile sample, because that's very common for this kind of frontline worker, is that a lot of them will enter into employment and then leave within 6 to 9 months of starting the job, and it's hard to track down migrants in general, and particularly migrant workers in city contexts. It's really, really hard. But some of the main reasons that migrants leave include responsibilities at home, including family and potential marriage, because these women are fairly young, and a lot of them are recruited when they're unmarried, as well as mental health issues. A lot of these women are leaving home when they come to the city for the first time. Many of them have never seen a 10-story building in their lives, and so this is very, very new environment for them. They grew up particularly the migrants that we were working with from Odisha, where very rural migrants, mostly doing farming activities, with very little exposure to sort of urban, formal sector work. A third of them graduated above grade 10. About 3/4 had a smartphone at baseline. And then let me just tell you a few things about knowledge. So kind of knowledge at baseline was quite poor. A third of the participants did not mention cough as a symptom of COVID-19. A half didn't mention fever as a symptom. A quarter recommended antibiotics for symptomatic individuals. 1 in 10 recommend taking cow's urine for treatment. A full third of the sample believed that turmeric was protective against COVID-19. And a fifth thought that religion, plays a role in the spread of COVID-19. And so, obviously, misinformation plays a huge role here. And a lot of the information that this group in particular was receiving was indeed through just word of mouth, and or virtual word of mouth through WhatsApp and other types of kind of rumor mills. Okay, so now some results. As I mentioned, we had 3 groups. So the live phone call, a pre-recorded audio group, and a text message group. And so with regard to information delivery, we can only measure certain kinds of delivery for the 2 groups that either that had some kind of phone interaction. For the text message group, it's a bit hard to assess, what the information transfer was. But for the phone call versus the pre-recorded audio group, here are the differences that we found. So, with regard to answering the phone, a very high percentage of both groups answered. It was slightly lower in the phone call group. So I'm going to ask you, was that related to the finding the actual person, or was this just the first response of whether you picked up the phone or not?
This we have slightly varying protocol for straight up, but this is basically, were we able to reach the person for information delivery? So if we didn't reach if they didn't answer the phone the first time, we might try second time or third time. We had protocols for that. But basically, in the end, did we reach this person or not? That's what this is. And the difference is really, I really don't know what's going on there, because it's they should not know whether they're getting a phone call or an audio message, because we have these anonymized numbers. But there is a difference.
But for some reason, right, they just happen to pick up more in the pre-recorded group. So in terms of information content, before the individuals hung up the phone, the live call was able to get through almost all of the content, while the pre-recorded audio hung up much quicker. All the information was delivered for 2/3 of the sample for the phone call versus under 50% for the pre-recorded audio group. And then as the previous slide also mentioned, there was a lot more requests to repeat the information in the live phone call group versus the pre-recorded audio group. So all that kind of hints at the idea that knowledge absorption was indeed greater when there was a live phone call.
One quick question about the last one.
Yes.
This might be more salient as you think about scaling this up, because in some this time when you did the experiment, if I'm not mistaken, the workers were not going to the factory as much. They had started PPE production, as you mentioned, but things were not close to normal as they might be when you're able to do the scale up. Does that mean that you would anticipate that the percentage of people who would answer the phone or be able to even receive pre-recorded audio would be much lower? I ask because in our own attempts, when we've tried to reach people on audio in what was considered peacetime, if you will, it's much lower. So in this, I'm like, these are really impressive numbers.
Well, yeah, I mean, so first off, hats off to Sadish and the team at GBL for making a protocol that actually got through to people. So that's pretty. It is. I was also very happy with that. But to answer the question regarding the scale up, so actually, I think the conditions would be pretty similar because. For example, right now, Bangalore area just started a 14-day full lockdown. So people, again, are not going to factories. They're, again, in exactly the same situation. So I think we would likely see similar rates of connectivity. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, unfortunately, like I said, I mean, the situation, again, is very similar, if not worse, Okay. So, this is basically just looking at the distribution of information content. So essentially like the number of paragraphs that were delivered across these two groups, the phone call versus the pre-recorded audio. And essentially, what you find is for the vast majority of calls, the live person got through all of the content versus for the pre-recorded audio, there's a much broader distribution. So only about 40-something% got through all the paragraphs, and most of the phone calls were cut by the participant before that. So this again just means just the actual sheer amount of content delivered is greater under the phone call. Manoj?
Okay.
Oh, sorry. Okay. Okay. So
comment, but I'll send you an email. That might be easier. This is not worth getting into.
oh, sure. Okay. Cool. Okay. So what do we find? So essentially, in terms of mental health and knowledge, when we looked at the three groups together, we basically found that there was little difference between the text and the audio, pre-recorded audio groups. So throughout the analysis, just for power, we lumped them together into one group, and we compare that against live calls. So essentially what you find is when you look at a kind of index of knowledge, a standardized index of knowledge questions, what you find is that you get through much more, and you actually increase the amount of knowledge that people have using the live call compared to the text or the audio, and that difference is just shy of significant at standard levels. And then when we administered the PHQ-4, looking at essentially measures of anxiety and depression, what we found is that people were much less likely to be anxious and show signs of anxiety and depression under the live call compared to the text or the audio.
Can you remind us what is the time delay? Like this, so they had their phone call, and then how much after that was this assessment made?
That's a great question for Sadish.
Roughly 2 to 3 weeks.
2 to 3 weeks. Okay. And then
So-
follow-up question is what we have here is the PHQ-4. It's the 2 PHQ items and the 2 anxiety items, right? The GAD items. And did you separate those out? Okay.
We look at them separately also. You can take over.
No, go ahead, please.
No, I was just saying, we did separate them out. I don't think it's in the slides, but we did separate them.
Was there any difference, or they kind of, is that why you lumped them here? Is that the effect was kind of the same on the depression and anxiety?
Yeah, I think it was similar. I'll have to look at I think we have that result in our appendix, but I believe it was pretty similar across both anxiety and depression. Yeah. But I'll verify that in the appendix. So, okay. And then, sorry, this is just, the same thing when we're sort of controlling for, surveyor effects. And since we did this over several trial rounds, we also control for trial round effects. And then finally, there's a bit of attrition. About 18% of the sample ended up attriting across the study period, and so we do some inverse probability weighting to correct for that, and don't find very much substantial change in the results. Okay. So this is just kind of breaking down results for individuals with and without smartphones. And so the idea here was just basically that those individuals with smartphones kind of had regular access to lots of information, also maybe proxied for socioeconomic status at baseline, even though I think the bandwidth of that is fairly narrow amongst this very selected group of migrants from Odisha. But essentially, what we find is, as hypothesized, our knowledge effects were largest for individuals who did not have smartphone access at baseline. And so, providing them with that live call was had really meaningful impacts on on knowledge. On the other hand, we find no effects on knowledge for the group that had a smartphone at baseline. And then, if you look at the PHQ-4 result here, you find, pretty similar, impacts. They're slightly larger in the group without smartphones, but the effect still exists in the group that had smartphones, with the caveat that in both cases, our samples are kind of, much smaller, so the p-values are also larger. Okay, so we can run this in a kind of interactive specification, and we actually can control for, the interactions of treatment with, baseline measures of cognitive ability or cognitive function. And the results kind of hold up there. So it's not just about those with smartphones having kind of higher ability at baseline. It's something about that kind of ability to access information easily that seems to be driving those results. And so I guess there's one other quick thing I wanted to talk about, which is we can also do an analysis in which we sort of control for the amount of information that was delivered. When we compare across phone call versus the pre-recorded audio, as I mentioned, we have these kind of measures of information content delivery. And it turns out that in itself doesn't significantly change the coefficient size on mental health for the difference between phone calls and pre-recorded audio. So, controlling for a proxy of the amount of information that was absorbed, doesn't explain the size of the mental health effect. And so that led us, I think that's perhaps the most intriguing, but also, part of the study that we unfortunately have to kind of leave in the air, which is that, perhaps there's something about the interaction, even though it was highly standardized across the two groups, that had effects on mental health that was beyond just knowledge delivery. And so would love to hear your, because I think that's key, I think, as we scale this thing up, what exactly was driving that, and why participants, felt better after having talked to that real person is a question we don't have something definitive to say from the results of this study. There's some hypotheses out there, but I'd love to hear your thoughts on in terms of why we might see that and how that might influence what we do when we scale this thing up using live calls. Great, so let me stop there. And so I would like to describe a little bit about what we're planning on the scale up and then get your thoughts, but I also wanted to just wrap up on the sort of study and see if you guys had any questions related to that before I move on to the scale up feature. Sorry, did I think Manoj and Asha appear maybe frozen. Can you guys hear me still, or?
I can, yeah, but they are frozen. You're right.
Okay, they might have. Maybe there was a correlated shock there. Also, Pietro, how are you? Nice to see you.
Nice to see you too.
Are you spending some time at UNC or?
No. I'm in Zurich, but
Okay.
Asha is kind enough to send me the links. Yeah.
Oh, that's awesome. Okay. I was like, oh, cool. Yeah, I didn't expect to see you, but that's wonderful that you came. Thank you.
Yeah.
Hey, Manoj, I guess you might have frozen there for a second, but
we both lost internet simultaneously. Our AT&T.
Yeah,
sorry about that.
Related shock there, but oh, there you're back now. You're back in spades. There you go. Cool. So yeah, what I was just saying was any other comments on the uh, on the paper itself before I talk about the scale up?
There was one question on your previous slide I was going to ask. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
On the PHQ, on the one with the smartphones, without the smartphones. Yeah. Do you expect to see a difference with and without smartphones here? This is what I was going to ask earlier as well. Do you expect to see a large difference between these two? It seems like there is a bit of a difference here. I mean, of course, you will control for it in your regressions and stuff, but do we expect to see that, or is there something weirder going on there?
Sorry, different. I guess I didn't understand. So say the difference.
So I'm looking at the 3.18 versus the 2.6, right? And smaller differences between the two on 2.4, 2.49 is probably small, but maybe that is exactly what you're pointing out to, is that without the smartphones, it causes a lot more depression, and that's really what you're talking about.
Right. So that yeah. So I think there was no significant differences across those two groups, but
I see.
but that does seem to be suggestive of what you're saying. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Cool. Thanks.
Yeah. Great. Any other questions on results?
I had a question. Sorry, yeah, we lost
Please.
internet there for a second, so somebody asked this, but I mean, this to me is sort of the most compelling figure of the paper, and it shows that you really had a mental health intervention and not as much of a knowledge intervention, and especially given that 75% of people had smartphones in this very, very, very low SES kind of
Right.
a population. So, and now several months later, it seems that probably most people are inundated with all sorts of information. Some of it is wrong, some of it is right. And that as you scale up, you know that you'll be providing correct information, but the people, for them, it's just like another data point in the sea of information that they're getting. But I feel like the being able to connect with a live person, so I think it does several things. One is just people's longing to connect with somebody who knows something is very comforting. And two, it also, I mean, this might be a smaller thing, but it also gives this perception that like somebody knows what they're doing because they're organized enough to have this phone campaign to call and to reach out to people. So it could actually give you a little, false or not, true or not, like sort of this sense that like, okay, the government, or whoever, is sort of, they're taking care of us. They're going out of their way to do this. And so versus, this narrative that, the powers that be are really screwing everything up. And that is very anxiety producing. So there's sort of this, in addition to the social support, connection with another human being, there's this, message of competence, and it's like the keep calm and carry on,
That's really
a thing that could be there because somebody called you and said, I just want you to know that this is what it is, and and you take care of yourself, and that can be done very short, but so yeah, so I was just thinking
that's really interesting. Yeah, and gets exactly to what I was asking, I think, when you guys froze, which is basically, I think this is the, to me, the most interesting part of the study, but unfortunately the part where we don't have anything definitive to say, because, we actually don't know what was driving, what that mechanism was. But I think you're exactly, I mean, you're pointing to something really interesting that I hadn't considered before, which is maybe it is this feeling of competency and calm, or that that whoever the power is like investing in taking care of me, and that and having someone real talk to me. I think that's really interesting. Yeah, sorry, Manoj.
Hey, Arch, before you turn on, sorry, Pietro, were you about to ask something? I can wait.
Just one quick thing, but it's just so since you did mention to like what could be the potential mechanisms, one unsubstantiated anecdote that I've heard that kind of reminded me of this is that children don't learn language from television, but they only learn it from real people. So if you show them just programs.
That's interesting.
And you put them in front of a screen, they don't learn necessarily the language, but they learn it from allegedly they learn it from live people. So somehow there's a distinction made there, and it seems to be similar to what you have here. Now, again, I premise this with an unsubstantiated anecdote because I don't remember where I heard that, and I don't know if it's scientific or just an anecdote, but I think there could be something to it, that there is a human connection even through a phone that distinguishes it from a recorded message.
That's fascinating. Wow. Okay, I'll have to look for that. Um, the funny thing in the back of my mind is that I have a friend from high school who has a fairly successful like language learning app. I mean, not for children, for adults, but it leverages essentially like using subtitles with foreign language films as a way to learn. So anyway, um,
And I mean, for adults, it could work. I mean, yeah.
Anyway, sorry, Manoj, you were gonna add something?
So, Acha, I wanted to just go back to the earlier part of your paper. Don't have to go through slides or anything, but you told us that one of the reasons why this was interesting motivation was you might expect that people might make worse decisions if this kind of anxiety or depression is induced by the kind of phone calls or information campaigns per se. So, given that you've worked in these settings and you've been following these folks, do you have any information about types of decisions they might be making, and are there any other effects?
That's a great question. I think we had looked at, I think not within the short time span that we looked here. Satish, can you just to verify is that right? Like, I don't think we looked at like actual self-reported behaviors, et cetera, did we?
No, we did not.
Yeah, but I think if we had to do it again, I think it would be very useful to look at, self-reported stuff around COVID-19 behaviors, social distancing and mask wearing and things, and vaccine take up. But
Or even things around productivity that might be more salient to the work environment that
yeah,
you might be able to pick up from your administrative data rather than even doing surveys on them for that.
yeah.
Or do you see higher absenteeism rates there? Do you see people not showing up to work or having to leave early, or all kinds of stuff that you might have
Yeah,
in
that's
your...
right, actually. So let me just ask Sadish, presumably we have the identifiers for those individuals still, right? Um,
We do,
that may be
but
something
I think
that we look up and, like look at retention and absenteeism and that sort of thing post lockdown. Obviously, that was like a very special period, but we could track out these folks using the administrative data fairly easily on that stuff, at least retention, absenteeism, salary and things like that. So we could, yeah, I mean, it might be really interesting to see whether this had a retention effect, for example. Cool. Yeah, that's a great suggestion. Actually, Sadish, we should definitely look at that. Eh, so I guess, yeah, this is all super useful, and I think in thinking about scaling up, we're as I mentioned, just starting to broach this conversation both within Good Business Lab, the nonprofit that I helped found, and with partner organizations. And I think the idea is the following: if you guys um, can stick around for a few minutes, I'd love to chat about it. And for those, I know the actual seminar ends like nowish, so those of you who have to leave, then please, happy to say bye at this point.
I
Cool.
think some of us can stay.
Okay. And so just to get, just really briefly, basically we were, of course, we're all watching in horror at what's happening in India, and we're really, actually within the organization, just, have tons of, COVID positive experiences and, folks who are sick and survey enumerators who have, who are sick, and lots of folks who have families are sick, et cetera. So it's just a really hard time right now. But I think there's also like a pervading sentiment that, we'd like to do something to help. And I think one of the main things we're thinking about, we have a few different pots of stuff that we'd like to intervene on. But, one of the nice things about this study is that, the impacts on mental health were quite large. And the intervention was actually, fairly light touch, and, can be, is designed to be done over the phone. So we can overcome, the standard constraints of interaction, in person. So what we're thinking is essentially, we have the numbers of something like 100,000 workers within our partner organization, Shahi Exports, garment workers who are, who are currently employed at the firm. We also have, through industry guilds and that kind of thing, access to other employers and their kind of, phone bank data. So there's, potential to affect a really, really large number of workers in a short period of time. And so we started thinking, well, the results of this study suggest that live phone calls matter a lot, and that, the information delivery is only a small part of that, that there may be this kind of just general additional effect of having them to talk to a live person. And that's relevant because I think, like, as you mentioned, Asha, I think since the last period of lockdown, and, when we ran this experiment, there's obviously been a huge amount of awareness increase related to what COVID is and how does it affect people, et cetera. There's still a lot of misinformation, but people just have been exposed to this as the only thing for a year now. So there's just people are saturated with information of all kinds. So it's not clear that information itself is going to actually do very, very much at this point. But just having someone to talk to may actually play a big role here. So that said, it's really difficult for GBL as an organization to actually take on calling 100,000 workers or even more workers, because we're struggling right now as an organization for manpower and motivation and all that, and there's just a lot of issues that people are going through in amongst GBL. So I think we need to potentially amplify this in a different way. And so then we came up with the idea that maybe we want to recruit volunteers who speak the languages that workers would be contacted in, which are mostly Kannada, Hindi, and Odia, and that we would essentially recruit volunteers mostly through social media and the like, and then put them through essentially like a phone banking software where we can give them prompts and make sure that we sort of, to the extent possible, regulate the flow of the conversation and, give scripts about the information to be delivered, maybe make a short training in the beginning. But then basically have this be done through crowdsourced volunteering, because, no single organization, I think, could handle that level of phone calls, because not only do you have to call folks, one time, you got to probably call them like 4 or 5 times to actually get through. And when we're talking about in the hundreds of thousands, that's just a lot of phone calls and time. So anyway, that's our basic idea. I think that the key, questions I had were, how do we guarantee or come as close as possible to, amplifying the mental health impacts that we saw in this study? That's number one. And the other question I had was, what do you think in terms of categories of information that would be valuable this time around? Because obviously last time was a much more rudimentary, like, information flow, and people's information was really bad. So, assuming that information is now better, even amongst folks who are low SES, et cetera, what should we prioritize? Should it be about the vaccine? Should it be about social distancing protocols, or what should we talk about?
So I just want to say I love the phone banking idea, just right, kind of taking that model of kind of what's done in the US around elections and that whole machinery. And I think you'll get a lot of people who want to help, right? I mean, just the same way why phone banking works. It's a very discreet way. There's people, I mean, you probably end up getting, the Indian diaspora wanting to like make these phone
Right.
calls,
No,
because
I
like,
feel the same way,
yeah, if you can just make a couple of phone calls. So I love that idea. I think, yeah, you definitely need to build in like trainings and but I really like that idea. And then my other thought about content, I think now maybe what's really important is, not so maybe people are saturated with the prevention, but the sort of, what do you do when you suspect symptoms of COVID? Some of the home treatment things, and I know not to like circle back to the cow urine thing, but the home remedies, and when do you really need to go to a hospital or not, or some of the, because I think people are in that emergency mode. So to say,
Right.
wear a mask and stay 6 feet away isn't really, nobody wants to hear that anymore. They want to know, like, if I start to feel sick, like, what do I need? I get panicky.
Right. And
So,
that point where I should say, okay, now I got to go into the hospital.
yeah, that might be that information isn't reaching as well. But I think also it would be important to like keep the pulse on, what are people knowing, so that you don't miss right. So your targeting might have to evolve a little bit, the messaging. Like it might be different, right, in the winter, or, or something.
Right.
I don't know, but I love this idea.
No, thank you. That's very helpfful. Yeah. Sorry, go ahead.
So just building on what Asha was just saying about what information, do you know Madhupai at McGill? He's a big name in global health and has been doing a lot of work. So anyway, Madhu and a bunch of people in India, Madhukar Pai,
Okay.
yeah.
Okay.
They've been doing this work. They launched the website just a couple of days ago, actually. I'm supposed to join them on phone calls. My schedule has been crazy, but let me put the link here. What they've been doing is developing very simple infographics in a bunch of different languages that helps provide accurate scientific information about managing COVID at home. And this could become useful sort of when you think about what information is useful and what you can provide in a science, like distill it down, probably big. And the good news is they have this in multiple languages. So I'm pretty sure you can get it in Hindi, Kannada, and Oriya as well, that you can then just take the PDFs and circulate that after the phone call.
That's so cool.
So I think that might be that useful for you to do when you do that.
They have it in Kannada, they've got it in Telugu, Hindi. I don't see Odia, but that's amazing.
Just yeah, you could write to them. Somebody will produce it if there is like takers in there. There's a whole volunteers who are helping out with this stuff. It's a fabulous team. They've been doing this quite nicely, actually. So that's one part. And the second thing about the volunteer stuff you mentioned, there are now in India, and I think one of the challenges with this is going to be, how do you find the volunteers? How do you staff this operation and keep it going? Because there will be a, big groundswell of support right now. And in 2 weeks, when deaths have happened and people get busy, that will die down. So one thing I would think about, and I'm not sure what the best way to do it is, there are a handful of organizations in India that are working on similar volunteer models, but much more for healthcare. So Swasth.app is a group. It's a Swasth Foundation that Nandan Nilekani and all of these big names in India have been backing. They
Swasth, like
SWASTH.app.
Okay. Got it.
So they have been doing a whole bunch of things, including volunteer stuff, but also providing care, creating networks, and all of that. If that's helpful, that might be one option. Then there's a couple of other smaller voluntary organizations. I know that Vikram Patel's group has a setup called Talk to Me. No, it's okay to talk to me, or something like that.
Okay. Huh.
In India, and it's basically a phone, not a phone banking, but it's a phone-based mental outreach type of effort. So there are a bunch of these that are now starting to become more common.
That's
you
great.
might
That's very
you could
useful.
partner with them, and that might make it sort of at least a little more practical for you to scale up pretty quickly.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's great. That's awesome. Vikram is all over the, mental health map. I feel like
Yeah.
everybody knows him. Yeah. I'm technically on a paper with him, but I only corresponded with him a few times. So.
Yeah, becomes like that. He's all over, definitely. One last thing, Arch, before we run out of, you to go. Since you're working in Karnataka, unless people have moved around a lot, the industry's commissioner in Karnataka, her name is Gunjan Krishna. Krishnan. Gunjan Krishna. Gunjan was one of the more sort of enterprising young IS officers had come across in Karnataka, and she was very keen on trying to think about how to think of worker productivity, help workers, and help the industries. So if you're thinking about at some point you have enough of a message that you want to pitch to them, if Gunjan's still there, I'm happy to connect you with there. But the industries commissioner would be the right place for person for you to talk to there as well.
That's great. That's great. And I'll definitely. I mean, I'm sure if she is like the leadership at Shahi is usually sort of like tapped into the appropriate government offices.
Yeah.
So I should check in on that. So yeah, thank you. This is awesome. It was very, very helpful, and I'll definitely check out these links. I think we're we want to scale. We got to use partners. So that's great if for example, Vikram has stuff going on that's using phone banking software already. That's going to be a huge leg up. So I'll definitely check that out.
Cool.
Very cool.
This was very, very useful. Thanks a lot, guys. It comes at a wonderful time. So thanks for taking the time out, everybody, and in particular you guys. You're a dynamic duo.
This was really nice. I really enjoyed it. So yeah, and I want to hear how it goes and the scale up and everything. That's really
for sure.
cool.
I'll keep you posted. Yeah. Thank you.
Yeah. Awesome.
Thanks, both of you. Thanks, Adesh.
Right.
Yeah.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Take care. Bye.